Hi, welcome to our August Liberal Values Lab. This month we have Rio Veradonir. Rio, I always say that quickly. Rio Veradonir. Did I say it right that time? Yes. Sorry,
Yes.
I get very excited and I say it quickly and then I stumble. You know, it's a really interesting last name. Anyways, Rio is the editor of Queer Majority magazine that we is a partner with the Institute for Liberal Values. It is one of the only, if perhaps the only magazine dedicated to LGBT issues that is what we would consider liberal. And that's what we're going to talk about today. So Rio gave this discussion at a counterweight conference on diversity and inclusion and doing diversity and inclusion differently. And so his panel was titled liberal different or a liberal approach to queer diversity and inclusion. And so we're going to do that again now live for you. I think it was a great panel. For those of you who are watching us but not a member of Circle, keep in mind that if you're a member of Circle, you can actually type in your questions and join the conversation. For other of you who are watching it and want to see it again, this will be by next week on our ILV YouTube page, which we will put up on our ILV Twitter, or I'm sorry, X as we're calling it now. So with no further ado then, Rio, please take the mic and tell us a little bit more about a liberal approach to queer diversity.
Great. Thanks for the introduction, Jen. Yeah, as you said, I did this for Counterweight originally. It got a lot of really good positive responses and reactions from people. In fact, people kept asking me this question about what does a liberal approach to diversity and inclusion look like? Because most people know it as DEI, or diversity, equity, and inclusion, and they think of it as this kind of politically motivated, highly ideological, relatively left or even far left thing. So what could a liberal approach actually mean? Then really briefly, I'll speak on what you said about Queer Majority being perhaps the only liberal LGBT magazine. Some people might hear that and think, huh? I thought that liberals were like very pro LGBT rights. Well, they are, if you think of liberal as like a synonym for, say, the Democratic Party in the United States. Mm-hmm. But if you think of it as a philosophy, which is bigger than any party and which could include some Democrats and some Republicans, but also exclude some Democrats and some Republicans, liberalism as a philosophy really is something that the LGBT movement, activist class at least, has moved away from. And it's not just LGBT issues, but also feminism, anti-racism issues, et cetera, have been taken over by an anti-liberal form of identity politics. And so what I'm trying to do with this little talk is to show people how to talk about and write about and teach about LGBT issues, but using a consistently liberal framework. And not only is it nice to be, principled and liberal, but as I'm about to show, it actually works better than the DEI critical approach anyway. So let me just click here and I'll get the slideshow going.
And while you're doing that, I do appreciate, thank you for, I'm so seeped in this, Institute of Liberal Values. To me, the definition, which by the way, for anyone watching, we define on our website, ilvalues.com or .org. I don't even know my own, but we define, what that is and what liberalism looks like and where we've departed from that. So I think thank you for that.
And thank you, Jen. Could you say a little something about how people would ask questions throughout and all of that?
Yes. So for those of you who are in Circle, go ahead and type your questions in. If it's something that is addressing an immediate point during Rio's presentation, I will stop him. If it's a more general question, I will ask it at the end. But keep in mind, there's a little chat box there for those of you who are joining us on Circle for you to type in your questions.
All right, great. So I'll get started here. And I guess you'll just speak up if you have a question for me, Jen?
Absolutely.
Okay, sounds good. All right, liberal approach to queer diversity and inclusion. So there are really two distinct approaches to thinking about queer issues. Well, there are more than two, but the two we're going to be focusing on here are the liberal approach and the critical approach. The liberal approach centers universal rights, so it emphasizes individuality. Whereas the critical approach centers identity politics, emphasizes group status. The liberal approach advocates equality or equal treatment under the law, and the critical approach advocates equity or equal outcomes. The liberal approach operates by persuasion, so it believes in free speech and open dialogue, whereas the critical approach operates by coercion, and it tries to silence privilege. This is key. Everything we know shows that the liberal approach actually works and the critical approach does not work. What we mean by that is the liberal approach works at expanding social acceptance of LGBT issues or women's rights or anti-racism, whatever you're talking about, whereas the critical approach actually tends to backfire and make social acceptance actually decreases, can increase hostilities. Why doesn't the critical approach work? Well, it makes members of minority groups less happy, and it alienates members of majority groups. If you think about it, if you tell somebody, oh, you're an LGBT person, therefore you're oppressed and life is going to be really hard for you, that's kind of a downer. And at the same time, if you tell somebody, oh, as a cis straight guy, you're part of the oppressor class and you need to check your privilege, that tends to alienate them. So the liberal approach doesn't do that. This is a cartoon from Queer Majority. You can see here, white, male, heterosexual, you're out from the PC police. All right. So the critical approach actually increases intergroup hostilities. People are more afraid of communicating and collaborating. And here's a source. It's a meta-analysis by Musalar Garbi. Liberalism. Without liberalism, there would be no LGBT rights. And without liberalism, they have no future. So this is Karl Heinrich Ulrichs. You can see here he's already making the liberal case as one of the very, very earliest LGBT activists. So the point here is to show that liberalism is the foundation all along. Sexual orientation is a right established by nature. Legislators have no right to veto nature, no right to persecute nature, in the course of its work, no right to torture living creatures. So let's look at a case study. Same-sex marriage is obviously one of the big success stories of the LGBT rights movement. So how did this come about? Well, there was a liberal approach and a critical approach to activism around this issue. The liberal approach supported same-sex marriage on the basis that it believed in equal treatment under the law. So if straight people can be married, so should gay people be able to be married, and bi people. Whereas the critical approach opposed it. They dismissed marriage, the entire concept of marriage, as bourgeois respectability politics. The liberal approach succeeded at reforming marriage through democratic and legal persuasion, whereas the critical approach failed at their goal, which was to actually dismantle marriage as a cis heteropatriarchal institution. So the critical side tried to do away with marriage altogether, and they failed. The liberal side sought to reform marriage so that we could integrate LGBT people into our liberal society, and they succeeded. And here's another cartoon, CSJ throwing the nuclear family out with the baby out with the bathwater. So the liberal approach, we now have over 70% electoral support for same-sex marriage in the West, whereas the critical approach really just caused a backlash. It's now legal in over 30 countries, same-sex marriage. Critical approach didn't really achieve anything other than a backlash. The liberal approach now celebrates this progress today. Wow, we achieved that in such a short period of time. Isn't that a wonderful thing? Whereas the critical approach denies progress. They try to downplay it and say like, oh, that really only matters to middle-class white people or whatever. So again, we see liberal approach works and the critical approach doesn't work. Andrew Sullivan, a famous LGBT activist, said, if you change the society and the culture, the politics will follow. That's key to the liberal approach. We seek to persuade people and to reform our system. We put the persuasion first and the politics after. Whereas the critical approach tries to kind of force the politics on society against their will in a undemocratic and authoritarian manner. This is an article. There was an article called Straight, Gay, or Lying, Bisexuality Revisited way back in 2005. This is not by us. This was the New York Times. And a lot of bi activists were really upset about that, and they thought, well, how do we change the public perception around this issue? What the critical activists did is they just got mad and said, oh, how dare scientists try to test this? Science is a tool of the oppressor, etc. And how dare journalists cover it? Journalists are all a bunch of elites, and they want to go down on the little guy, etc. Whereas what the liberal approach did is we sought to persuade, and we reached out to a scientist named Mike Bailey, and we helped him do his study better, and it ended up resulting in a positive outcome. And here you see the New York Times doing a cover story later to set the record straight. So this is a perfect example of the liberal approach working. In fact, it was a cover story in New York Times Magazine. So something we keep in mind in using the liberal approach is that science is on our side. It's not a tool of the oppressor. If the evidence doesn't support our hypothesis, maybe we're wrong. So instead of throwing science out, maybe we have to rethink our approach. The epistemic standard is not defined by does it conform to my beliefs, and the solution is always more science and better science. Vilifying scientists and undermining faith in science is bad. So again, that would be the critical approach. We don't do that. And then this was this is actually a QM article, Sex Beyond Labels. Peter Tatchell, a big activist, LGBT activist in the UK, wrote a piece for us. As the absolute labels once needed for acceptance begin to peel off, a clear trend reemerges. We're more bisexual than we think. So we've really achieved a lot using the liberal process here. However, there was a huge backlash among not really reliable QM readers, but among members of the general public who came across that article, probably because Peter is so high profile. And we had to put out this piece responding to it. But essentially, a lot of people were angry at Peter for suggesting that sexual orientation identity might matter less, because they wanted to cling to identity politics instead of moving past it and integrating and normalizing LGBT people. So we had to respond to that. Peter Tatchell believes that as LGBT rights are accepted, fewer people will feel the need to assert gay or straight identity. Why do some of these activists see that as bad news? And here's the cartoon again. We see Peter. That's actually an illustration of Peter on the left. He's trying to reach a post-homophobic society, but he's being held back by identity politics. So I used all of that as by way of another example of why the liberal process is better. Diversity. In a liberal framework, diversity is about celebrating differences as well as what we have in common, not dividing people on that basis. So again, that's contrasting it with the critical approach, which is more divisive. So in the spirit of being inclusive in a liberal manner, let's talk about some accurate, scientifically accurate terminology. Queer originally just meant strange, odd, or different. Sometimes it's used as an umbrella term for LGBTIA+, colloquial. We recommend that you use it as a broad, inclusive term for sexual, gender, relationship, and intimacy nonconformity in general. That's kind of an academic use, but that's the way we use it at Queer Majority, even though we write for a general audience. Here, this is a little confusing. You know, you've got LGB, LGBT, etc. Blah, blah, blah. What is all that about? Well, there's lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender. Most people are familiar with those terms. Sometimes intersex, queer, questioning, asexual, and ally, and plus. So I'll talk about those a bit more in a little bit. We recommend that you use LGBT when you're discussing, quote, the community, the LGBT community. That's fine. There's no need to include all those additional letters that just confuse people. And we recommend using queer when discussing that broader subject matter that includes all kinds of people who deviate from real or perceived norms around sex and relationships. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about sex, sexuality, and gender identity. Sex is a biological construct. So, you know, humans are a sexually dimorphic species. There's males and females. Sexuality means sexual orientation, homo, hetero, or bi, and those orientations are based on which biological sex you're attracted to. By contrast, gender identity is a cultural construct. This is what people mean when they say cis or trans. And intersex is not a third sex, and sex is not a spectrum. So set some scientific facts straight there. Because of the postmodern influence on the critical approach, they tend to dismiss science, but we liberals are believe in science. Now, it's important to point out that sexuality is a spectrum and it can be fluid. But sex itself is not a spectrum. Sexual orientation is, again, not defined by gender identity. It's defined by sex. So if you're a male attracted to a male, then you would be homosexual, regardless of anybody's gender identity. Homosexual, heterosexual, and bisexual. Homosexual means literally same sex attracted. Heterosexual means different sex attracted. Bisexual means both same and different sex attracted. So a lot of people think that the prefix bi is counting the number of genders. It's not. It literally means both homo and hetero, both same and different sex attracted. Defined by the relationship between one's own sex and the sexes to which one is attracted regardless of gender identity. That's a note on bisexuality. Okay, so Alfred Kinsey was a sex researcher, and he came up with the Kinsey scale, which goes from 0, exclusively heterosexual on one side, up to 6, exclusively homosexual on the other side. And you'll notice that everything 1 through 5 here are varying bisexual responses. So this is what I meant when I said that sexuality is a spectrum. There are 2 sexes, but clearly you can be more or less attracted to one or the other sex. And technically everything there is between 1 and 5 is bisexual. Sometimes we amusingly say like hetero-flexible if we're referring to a 1, or homo-flexible to a 5, but technically they're all bisexual. This is the Klein sexuality grid. Fritz Klein, another researcher, he expanded upon the concept of the Kinsey scale to talk about the past, present, and ideal. And he also talked about people's fantasies and their behavior and their emotional preferences and so forth. The point of this was not to confuse the helpful Kinsey scale, but to help people to see that sexuality can be much more complicated than just a matter of whether or not you act on it, right? So when we hear about how people are in the closet, well, somebody might even be out of the closet as bisexual, but never actually act on their same-sex attraction because maybe they didn't realize about themselves until after they were married to someone of the opposite sex and they're monogamous. So behavior is just one aspect of it, is the idea there. Here's what we call the AIB model, which stands for arousal or attraction, identity, and behavior. As you can see, there's overlap, but they don't always overlap exactly, right? So arousal and attraction is what's relevant for sexual orientation, regardless of someone's identity or their behavior. If their identity differs from their arousal and attraction, then they might be in the closet or they might not have realized their orientation yet. And if their behavior could deviate for any number of reasons. This is a little graph showing how asexuality relates to homosexual and heterosexual and bisexual. This is a often misunderstood concept. Basically, if you think of the left to right scale there as the Kinsey scale, and then you put a top to bottom scale, you could imagine that on the bottom of the triangle here is what you might call like hypersexual. So it's somebody who is extremely sexually aroused, they're easily turned on. And on the opposite extreme would be somebody who's asexual. So everybody really has a sexual orientation, but if you are so asexual in the sense of not being easily aroused, you might not perceive your orientation the same way. Although it's pretty rare for somebody to be right at that tip-top point. Usually they're somewhere else along the left to right spectrum, or sorry, top to bottom spectrum. All right, let's talk a little bit about sexual orientation diversity. So about 98 to 46% of people identify as heterosexual, depending on the way the question is asked or what poll you look at. And this also, by the way, depends upon which demographic, what kind of demographic you might be polling. So younger people are much more likely to be closer to that 46%, whereas the general population or older people are more likely to be the 98%. There's even lower levels of exclusively heterosexual attraction than the identity would suggest. And that when you look at and like test somebody's actual attraction, it's even lower still. So more people identify as heterosexual than are. Bisexuality varies from about 2% to about 43%. Again, 43% would be a relatively extreme example. You're probably looking at Gen Z people in like Cambridge University, something like that, right? So it's very, very educated, affluent, and young group of people. They tend to be the most likely to be out and identify as bisexual. The general public is much closer to that 2% number. But how this is key, the number of people who will admit in polls to having engaged in bisexual behavior is consistently even higher than the number who identify with it. And the number of people who will admit to being attracted to both sexes, even if they don't identify as bisexual, is higher still. Now, if we look at the homosexual numbers, you'll notice that the range is much smaller. This is probably because, for obvious evolutionary reasons, exclusive homosexuality tends to be selected against, but it does exist in humans. It's just about 2 to 7%. 7% of identity being, again, mostly that younger cohort. And the number of people who will admit to having bisexual attractions is even higher, and who have homosexual behavior is even higher as well. Of course, there's a lot of overlap between bisexual and homosexual there, and you can see my studies from Harvard and Williams Institute, et cetera, YouGov polls. Then let's look at asexual. Those arrows are just showing the overlap I was talking about. Asexual identity, as I said, is extremely rare. And people who will say they've never engaged in any sexual activity or literally never experienced any sexual attraction is even lower than that. So it's almost a rounding error when it comes to sexual orientations. And as I said, really technically, they probably all have either a straight, gay, or bi orientation. It's just that some people who are very asexually inclined don't experience their orientation in the same way because they don't experience much sexual arousal. Here's a cartoon. We show Pat Robertson from the 700 Club reading the Harvard Crimson study about bisexuality and seeing those numbers and going crazy over it. Okay, a little more on sexual orientation diversity. So to summarize some of the other points there, nearly all people are attracted to the opposite sex. Not exclusively so necessarily, but nearly everybody is attracted to the opposite sex. Many people are also attracted to the same sex in addition to the opposite sex. It's rare to be exclusively attracted to the same sex, but it does exist. And it's extremely rare to experience zero attraction. Another very early pioneering LGBT activist, Carl Maria Kurtbeny, again, making the liberal case right from the beginning, we should convince our opponents that exactly according to their legal notions, they do not have anything to do with this inclination. They mean homosexuality, or he does, or bisexuality. Let it be innate or voluntary, because the state does not have the right to intervene in what is happening between two consenting adults in private, not hurting the rights of any third party. Note the let it be innate or voluntary. That's key because we talk a lot about sexual orientation not being a choice, which is true in the sense that it's partially genetically determined and you can't really choose your sexual orientation. But whether or not it's a choice is kind of a red herring, morally speaking, at least from a liberal perspective. There are lots of things that we don't necessarily choose, but it doesn't mean that we want society to encourage or discourage them. Sociopathy, for example, right? But the point is whether it's innate or voluntary is irrelevant to the question of whether or not consenting adults who aren't really hurting anybody should be allowed to just live their lives without the government getting in the way. Very liberal. Gender identity diversity. All right. So cisgender, in general, over 99% of the population are cisgender. That means people who their gender aligns with their biological sex. So you're a male who feels like a man. Under that looks like negative 1%, but it should be under 1% of the population identify as transgender. Under 1% is transsexual. And almost nobody identifies as non-binary. Non-binary is something you hear a lot about. Conservatives like to throw it out to make fun of LGBT people and make it sound like we're all a bunch of crazy people, but really it's almost nobody who identifies as non-binary. It's like a few hipsters at a coffee shop in LA, basically. Now, there have been some changes to these numbers. I should mention those numbers along the left side there were up until very, very recently. That's what polls were showing. The number of people who identify as cisgender is lower now than it used to be. The number of people who identify as transgender is a lot higher. The number of people who identify as transsexual is a little higher. And the number of people who identify as non-binary is also a lot higher. Oh my gosh, wow, that's terrifying, right? This must be the crazy rise in transgender identity we hear about, right? 1,000%, that's insane. However, if you keep in mind, we're talking about small numbers to begin with. Yep, that's right. We're now looking at about over 97% of the general population identify as cisgender still. It's still a very small number of people who are trans men or women, an even smaller number of people who are transsexual. And actually, yeah, looks like there are a few more non-binaries now. But something to keep in mind is you could say that's a sign that non-binary is well, that a lot of LGBT people are really kooky or whatever. But really what it's actually suggesting is you're really looking at people who identify with a label that suggests that maybe they don't see themselves as conforming 100% with social norms around men and women. They're not even going to the level of identifying as the opposite gender. And so even though that's a slightly higher number, you're still talking about a minuscule number of people. All right, LGBT diversity trends, summarizing here. Nearly all people remain attracted to the opposite sex. Many more acknowledge attraction to the same sex. That's progress. It's probably due to greater social acceptance, and that's okay. It's a good thing, really. It's still rare to be exclusively attracted to the same sex. So some conservatives were worried that if we accepted same-sex marriage, suddenly 50% of the population would be homosexual. That didn't happen. And gender ID, it's still very rare to be transgender, even non-binary. That's a little trendy right now among the kids these days. All right. So there's a plausible evolutionary rationale for this diversity. Heterosexual attraction and behavior is procreative, but that doesn't preclude homosexual attraction and behavior. Bisexuality is thus common. It's been observed in over 1,500 species. Homosexuality, however, again, is rare. It's really only been observed in humans and domestic rams. Actually, Iona Italia, the managing editor at Quillette, tells me that some species of parrots might be domestic parrots, but it's very rare in nature indeed. Asexuality is even more rare and may be unique to humans, and it could be related to autism. That's okay. There's nothing wrong with being autistic. That's just a fact. And this is based on some studies in Nature. By the way, if you want a copy of this, you can have it. Just message me or Jen, and the sources are hyperlinked too.
I'll put this, by the way, in the YouTube link as well.
Oh, thank you. Yes. Yeah. Well, the whole slideshow? Perfect.
Yeah.
Great. Thanks, Jen. This is one of my favorite cartoons we've ever published. I just really like this. It's David Attenborough there saying, and here we see a male and female of breeding age clearly prepared for courting. So here we're making fun of the idea that animals would have something like a gender identity. It's just that's something that is unique to humans, and that's okay. That doesn't mean that there's anything wrong with it. It's just let's be aware of what's going on. It's very cultural. Okay, let's talk a little about inclusion. In a liberal framework, inclusion is a path to integration. It's not a Trojan horse for dismantling categories and systems. So opponents of LGBT rights want you to think that it's the latter. But it's really only the latter in that critical approach, that critical social justice approach, the anti-liberal approach. But in a liberal approach, the one that the vast majority of people believe in, it's really just about integrating into society. And that's a lovely thing. So now that we've covered basically the kind of the landscape, let's talk about some practical tools for how do we make people feeling included without alienating others. So how do you do the liberal approach to diversity inclusion as opposed to the critical one? Well, one is don't cast cis straight people as the enemy. Their cartoon here. LGBT and straight, the tanks are at war with each other, and that's actually an illustration of one of our writers sticking flowers into the tanks. Liberalism rejects zero-sum conflict in favor of incentivizing mutually beneficial cooperation. So they're not the enemy. Cis straight people are our compatriots. Don't be self-righteous. This is an illustration of one of our writers, Damien Imba, and you see the devil on his shoulder saying, righteous anger, you're right, they're wrong, no compromise. And the angel says, everybody else left. Yeah, exactly. That approach just alienates people. Don't do that. Inclusion is about tolerance, and that means tolerating respectful discussion. That means, I mean, you can call people out for being rude, but try not to mirror their energy back to them. We're only human, but staying reasonable can actually be much more persuasive. So, here's Karl Popper saying, unlimited tolerance must lead to the disappearance of tolerance. So this is his paradox of tolerance. If we extend unlimited tolerance even to those who are intolerant, if we are not prepared to defend a tolerant society against the onslaught of the intolerant, then the tolerant will be destroyed and tolerance with them. So that's what I meant when I said liberals can push back against intolerance in others, but we should never become intolerant ourselves, again, other than of intolerance. per Popper. All right. Don't discriminate. It sounds so obvious, but the critical approach is very discriminatory, telling cis white straight men to check their privilege and all that. Here we go. You see this lady's holding a sign that says, no straight white people, or down with straight white people. And this other guy's holding a sign that says, down with LGBT. And he says, welcome to our level. Yeah, let's not do that. We don't need to go down to their level. Replacing one form of prejudice with another is not progress, no matter what Ibram X. Kendi tells you. 4, do not other people as mere allies. This one's not as obvious to some people. But if you tell somebody they're just an ally, what that suggests is that they don't also benefit from living in a liberal and pluralistic society where we have freedom. And that's not true. It's actually much more effective to remind them that we all have this in common. Shun that brother. He's not one of us. He's just an ally. And by the way, when you're dealing with extreme LGBT activists, this just does literally happen sometimes. Like, oh, this is just an ally. He can stand out there at the parade, but he can't come to the party afterward or whatever. No, don't do that. Invite them to the party. Queerness is not unique to LGBT people. Most, arguably all of us, know what it's like to differ from real or assumed norms. So most of us conform with norms in most ways, but really just about all of us have something about us that's quirky and outside the norm. And so it's much more effective to remind people of the fact that we're all individuals and we all benefit from living in a free and pluralistic society. So actually, a really effective technique for seeing this is to ask people to list ways that cis straight people can be queer. So remember, being queer isn't bad. A stay-at-home dad could be queer, quote, queer in our society. That's increasingly becoming normalized, but it's still stigmatized in some places, especially conservative circles. BDSM, bondage, dominance, sadomasochism, that's still very stigmatized, probably more so than same-sex marriage. The old maid, woman who, has reached a certain age and she hasn't gotten married yet, or maybe she never wants to get married. That's also stigmatized. These are all ways that straight people and cis people can be queer, and so therefore you can help them to relate to the ways that LGBT people are. Made to December relationships. So like a 30-year-old and a 50-year-old dating, some people find that deeply upsetting. But if it's consensual, and everybody is, being respectful about it, then liberals shouldn't really have a problem with that. And that's a stigma that impacts straight people as well. Polyamory, loving more than one person, or even in some cases, marrying more than one person. Interracial marriage, still a stigma against that in many places, used to be much more of one. People choosing to forego children. Sodomy does not only refer to gay sex, it also refers to oral sex and anal sex done by heterosexual couples. So basically anything other than boring missionary position pretty much could be categorized as sodomy, and sodomy laws historically have discriminated against many straight people as well. Aromantic folks, that's kind of like asexual, except they don't experience romance the way most people do. There's many, many more examples than that, but you get the point. Some cis straight people actually experience more discrimination under existing law than some LGBT people. The laws against polyamory, for example, to polyamorous marriage. Here's another cartoon. That's the author. Judge not the book by its cover. Erotic BDSM queer. Meet the author. So this is one of our writers is a straight guy, and he writes erotic queer literature, and his readers are always surprised to discover that he's just kind of a normal straight dude. Consensual BDSM can land people in major legal trouble regardless of sexuality or gender identity. Consensual is key there. So again, LGBT people are not the only folks who have been discriminated against, and in the West, many straight people actually are more discriminated against. It's another cartoon, Good Husbands, illustrating polyamory. Notice the guys are all smiling. That's clearly a consensual situation. Same-sex marriage is legal, but polyamorous relationships are still not recognized, both regardless of anyone's gender identity. So, point made. 5, don't force people into boxes or claim to speak for them. This is important. Trying to speak on behalf of all LGBT people as if we're all the same, or to demonize all cis straight people as if they're all the same. Let's not do that. A tactic used by extremists and ironically populists is to falsely speak for entire socioeconomic classes as if they were a monolith. They never are, right? So, Marx tried to do that on the left. Trump is doing some of that on the right. It's true, whatever type of class of person you're talking about, sex, sexuality, race, literal economic class, we're all individuals. That's actually an illustration of me, somebody saying, get in the LGBT communist box. And I'm saying, no, thanks. Yeah, that's the critical approach, uses intersectionality and tries to insist that if you are an LGBT person or a woman or a person of color, that you have to make common cause with other oppressed classes like the proletariat, and therefore you must be a literal communist. That's silly nonsense. Obviously, many LGBT people, most of us, in fact, are capitalists. LGBT people, like cis straight people, fall all over the political spectrum. Don't let either side dominate the discussion. All right, 6, don't make the mistake of thinking the enemy of my enemy is my friend. You're seeing a lot of this happen right now. A lot of neo-Marxist radical feminists siding with the Christian right and things like that. Now, just because you have a common enemy doesn't mean that this other person is your friend. Another cartoon. Maybe this hookup wasn't the best idea. He's got a Bible Belt guy on our left and a QAnon tinfoil hat conspiracy theorist on our right, or his left. We're using a liberal framework, not an alt-right, far-right, theocratic, or fascist one. CSJ isn't the only threat to liberal values. So this is relevant to the whole don't see the enemy of your enemy as your friend. Liberals might be temporarily at odds with critical social justice, but that doesn't mean that we should be allying ourselves with those groups. Why? Because they're also anti-liberal. Right, number 7, don't be elitist or condescending. Inclusion means using language everyone can understand. I've tried to do that here. I tried to define some of the more obscure terms. We can all do better, but it's generally a good tactic. It's another cartoon. Non-binary depictions of gender help eradicate toxic hypermasculinity and dismantle hegemonic heteronormativity. The other guy's thinking, I might even agree with you if I knew what the fuck you were saying. Like, yeah, that's, it's great if you went to Yale or Brown, you can talk like that, but not everybody can, and that's okay too. Case in point, Latinx. Latinx is a term that fortunately is falling out of fashion, but is still used too often in progressive or far left circles. The vast majority of Latino people don't use it, including Latino LGBT people. You can't pronounce it in Spanish, which is kind of revealing of the gringos who actually invented the term. Yeah, most Spanish speakers don't use it. And ironically, you could say that's cultural colonization, couldn't you? 8, be sensitive to ways you might offend specific groups. All right, we're going to say a little bit about how to avoid offending people. Not that you should always avoid offense, but if your goal is to persuade people and make them feel included, it's a good idea to avoid doing it if at all possible. So here's some bi-related concerns. Biphobia. It's not just watered down homophobia. Bi people experience, they can experience this sense of biphobia even within the LGBT community. So for example, I, as a bi guy, might go to a party, but was invited by a gay friend. Everybody else there is a gay man, or maybe a lesbian or two. And I might actually be treated as an outsider because of the fact that I'm bisexual, or I might even be told that bisexuality doesn't exist or something like that. So biphobia is not just homophobia. It's something to be sensitive to. Bi people can be accused of having straight privilege because of the attraction to the opposite sex, you should say. Attraction to the opposite sex is not a privilege. Bi erasure, yeah. So if you use a term like gay marriage, that's erasing the existence of bi people. So at Queer Majority, we try to say same-sex marriage because not everybody in a same-sex marriage is gay. Most of them, really, actually, statistically speaking, are bi. We say LGBT rights, not gay rights, for the same reason. We say pride, not gay pride. Again, not because there's anything wrong with being gay, but we're trying to be inclusive here. And there's bi invisibility. So something to keep in mind is a person's still bisexual regardless of their relationship status. We don't assume that someone is suddenly straight just because they're in an opposite sex relationship, or vice versa. One thing I like to point out is if people see me walking down the street holding hands with my wife, they assume I'm straight. If they see me walking down the streets holding hands with my boyfriend, they assume I'm gay, but I'm actually bi. You just are only seeing part of my life. Remember, bisexuality is common, fluid, and falls on a wide spectrum, even if it is often invisible. All right, let's say a little bit about cis people, cis-related concerns. This is about how to avoid offending cis people, which again is 97+% of the population. Yeah, so there is a branch of feminism called gender critical feminism. It's a major previously dominant approach to feminism. It believes that gender is a cultural construct and that rejecting gender is not the same as being non-binary. This is all compatible with liberal values, and it's okay for someone to believe that, and you don't have to change their mind in order for them to be trans inclusive. Gender ID, identifying cis is optional. So even though we use the word cis to mean somebody whose gender identity matches their biological sex, that doesn't mean you should go around calling people cis necessarily. If they don't want you to call them that, then just don't call them that. And just as identifying as trans or non-binary is optional. So yeah, don't force words on people, it just makes them angry. Most gender non-conforming people are not trans. This is definitely true. It's maybe 3% tops of the population are trans, including that approximately 2% are non-binary. There are way more people than that who don't conform to gender norms, and they still are not trans because it's identity-based and cultural. All right. Not everyone is okay with being labeled cis. Respecting gender identity means respecting that too. Encouraging gender non-conforming people to identify as trans or non-binary is sexist. Believe it or not, that happens. I've had a friend of mine, Kaylee, who also writes for Queer Majority, told me a story about how some people tried to tell her that she was non-binary because sometimes she wears pants and sometimes she wears dresses. I know it's ridiculous, but it happens. Let's not do that. Trans people, trans-related concerns. Trans is an umbrella term for anyone who is not cis, except for those who reject cis, or what we just said, transgender. They may or may not have, seek, or want medical treatment, and that's okay. They don't have to pass as the opposite sex. It does not require a diagnosis of dysphoria. It's a cultural identity. Transsexual. It's preferred by some, but regarded as offensive by others. So just be sensitive about who you're talking to. It usually means that the person has dysphoria and either has had medical treatment or wants medical treatment. Non-binary and gender fluid. Non-binary people do not identify as a man or a woman. And gender fluid is a sense that their gender fluctuates. So I'll remind you that this is in the cultural sense of the word of gender identity, not in the sense of a person's biological sex. You can't change sex. And trying to convince people that you can is only going to make them is only going to make LGBT people seem insane. So let's not do that. All right. Sex negativity rears its ugly head in the form of taboos against acknowledging that trans identity often has a sexual component. This is an understandable coping mechanism. So some trans-related concerns, things to understand with compassion and treat with diplomacy. Autogynephilia. It's a male arousal at the thought of oneself as female. It's a common cause of trans identity. Homosexuality or bisexuality, aroused by being attractive to heterosexual people. So there are some trans people who like the idea of being attractive to heterosexual people, and that's where their identity comes from. Dysphoria is psychologically at variance with one's sex, and gender identity is a cultural construct and may not be any of the above. All of that is separate from transvestism, which is not the same thing as being trans. It just means like drag queens and kings. They're often gay or lesbian or bi people, sometimes even straight people. It's not the same thing as trans identity. So actually, I'm going to go back and reiterate this point. Liberals are not sex negative. So if somebody's trans identity comes from the fact that they happen to be autogynephilic or whatever, that's fine because we're not sex negative, and let's get over it. All right. Revealing pronouns should be optional, and I mean optional. Now, some companies try to force people to reveal their pronouns. Don't do that. Here's that cartoon, the gender reveal, she, her, it's blown up in her face. What's the reason for this? It's because if you force people to reveal their pronouns, you might be outing a trans person who isn't ready to come out yet. And you can also just alienate other people. Some women don't want to reveal their pronouns in their emails, business emails, because they're worried about sexism, things like that. So it's just not a good idea. Try not to be authoritarian in your organizations. Respect neo-pronouns and metagenders, really. And neopronouns and metagenders, these are silly Tumblr identities. When I said don't be so serious, not taking them seriously means laughing it off and acting like it's no big deal. People who think that this is a sign that civilization is collapsing are taking it way too seriously. Some people's pronouns should be killjoy. That's an illustration of Gilbert Gottfried. So point made. Lesbians and gay men. Lesbian, gay-related concerns. Biological sex. Sexual orientation terms are about sex, right? So they're defined based on your sex, your biological sex, and the sex to which you're attracted. Criminalization of same-sex behavior was the issue for these people. That's why it's so important to them. Like, why do they care about sexual orientation being redefined in terms of gender identity by some activists? Because that wasn't really what the fight was about. The fight was about decriminalizing same-sex behavior. And so those definitions are important to them, and that's okay. Pressuring homosexual people to be attracted to the other biological sex is homophobic. Yeah. So telling people, for example, they're transphobic for being homosexual is wrong. Don't do that. Gender identity. This is a separate, equally important issue from biological sex. So just as important, but not the same thing. Don't conflate them. Some gay and lesbian identified people are attracted to certain trans identified people, and some are not. And that's okay too. Identity, behavior, and attraction are complex. Don't force people into your box. Let them be individuals. 9, don't get bogged down in semantics. So there are colloquialisms galore around LGBT issues. Lesbian, gay, bi, and straight. You've got terms like butch and lipstick and dyke. Twink, bear, otter, femboy, boy, top, bottom, verse, dom, sub-switch, mask, femme, etc. There's the bi-plus identities, pansexual, polysexual, multisexual, omnisexual, heteroflexible, homoflexible, fluid, queer, etc. Neopronouns, remember I mentioned those guys? And metagenders. G, gem, and Z here, and ver, and all that. You've heard of all these. Agender, bigender, demigender, gender flex, gray gender, intergender, pangender, polygender, etc. Why am I throwing all these out? It's to, again, make that point that it's actually not that big of a deal. If somebody tries to tell you this is a sign that society is collapsing, just laugh at them. And if somebody asks you to call them gray gender, just chuckle and say, sure, why not, buddy? Right? It's not that big of a deal. 10, don't expect perfection from yourself or others. Shaming people for not doing enough doesn't result in them doing more. It usually results in them doing less. So yeah, telling somebody that they're an evil, transphobic, homophobic person because they won't use the pronouns that you want them to use, that's not going to actually change their minds. It's likely going to just make them hate you and perhaps be even less receptive to your message. You're going to be much more persuasive by being friendly to folks. So here's another cartoon. We see this statue of a hero seal fed baby seals, and the tourist is saying probably still uses plastic straws. Right, that's human nature. We all like to judge one another, but you know we can all do better. It doesn't mean that you shouldn't. Enough is enough, right? Okay. You can't please everyone. So be prepared for these accusations. So this is when you're using the liberal approach. We just summed up through the last 10 things, 10 techniques for using the liberal approach. Okay, well, when you use the liberal approach, you're still not going to please everyone. You'll please most of the people most of the time because liberalism is very inclusive and very reasonable, but you can't please everyone. And so you do need to be prepared for these things. Be ready for accusations of appropriation. Here's a cartoon. Ooh, appropriate me, daddy. Liberalism is multicultural and recognizes that desires to keep cultures separated with no mixing are ethnocentric, racist, sexist, homophobic, etc. So accusing people of appropriation, that's something that's going to happen to you, but this is your pushback. Just say like, well, you know, we're multicultural and cultures mix and it's not that big of a deal. Expecting them not to mix is the thing that's actually wrong, hence the whole ethnocentrism, etc. You can't please everyone. Be ready for accusations of bootlicking, right? So if you're a liberal, then you're an evil bootlicking capitalist. So another cartoon, dictatorship of the LGBT proletariat, and the cops are saying bootlickers back at them, so we're turning it around. Liberalism is not anarchistic for the very important reason that there can be no peace, liberty, or human rights without an accountable is key, liberal state. So believing in liberalism doesn't make you a bootlicker, it makes you sane. You can't please everyone. Be ready for accusations of rainbow capitalism. We won't be accepting any late-stage capitalist gold. Liberalism is not anti-capitalist or against corporations. It's a good thing that capitalism is flexible and that corporations are responding to matters of queer rights. There's your response to that accusation. You can't be pleased everyone. Be ready for accusations of being obsessed with sex. Right. So if you believe in LGBT rights, you must be obsessed with sex, right? The cartoon, proposal for modesty. You can't. Oh, well, so I guess what you could say is the people who are obsessed with sex are the ones who are trying to outlaw same-sex behavior, etc. Right? Be ready for accusations of speech as violence, right? Speech is literally violence. Have you heard that from a critical activist? I have. Enemies of liberalism always look for excuses to silence critics. If speech is literal violence, then censorship is just self-defense. We've got a cartoon, unlikely members of the same book club, both book burners. Yeah, so both sides want to silence us. Let's not let them do that. Pointing out that the other side does it too can also be a useful tactic. All right, so we're almost done. Quick summation here. A liberal approach to queer diversity and inclusion. Including LGBT people does not require abandoning liberal values, no matter what critical activists tell you. Liberalism was historically and remains the best approach for spreading and preserving LGBT rights, in fact. A liberal approach to diversity and inclusion and equality is the most effective at fostering a positive environment. Today we have same-sex marriage, over 70+% electoral support. By the way, that means that's a sign of more than just the fact that people support same-sex marriage. It's a sign of the fact that people are being more tolerant of LGBT folks. That's a huge cultural achievement. We have anti-discrimination protections in over 30+ countries so far. Liberalism is working. We need more of it, not less. Don't believe anybody telling you that we're in a post-liberal world or that liberalism has failed. It has not. And we'll conclude here with one of the intellectual forebears of modern liberalism, Jeremy Bentham. He says, as to any primary mischief, it's evident that it produces no pain in anyone. It, in this case, is homosexual behavior. On the contrary, it produces pleasure. The partners are both willing. If either of them be unwilling, the act is an offense totally different to its nature of effects. It's a personal injury. It's a kind of rape. As to any danger exclusive of pain, the danger, if any, must consist in the tendency of example. But what is the tendency of this example? To dispose others to engage in the same practices. But this practice produces no pain of any kind to anyone. Well, so not only were the earliest LGBT activists liberals, but the earliest liberal activists were LGBT activists. Boom. And here's my contact. You can follow me on Twitter at @Veradonir, or you can email me rio@bi.org. Thanks.
All right, so we've got a few questions, and actually one of them dovetails with the question that I have for you. So the first question is, can critical theory be reconciled with a liberal goal to tolerate diversity of views within the liberal community?
Critical theory?
Mm-hmm.
It depends on what you mean by critical theory. I would say critical social justice ideology, which is a more narrow, specific thing, absolutely can't be, because what makes it critical is that it is critical of the liberal approach. Critical social justice writers and thinkers from the early days to now, a common theme is that liberalism isn't enough. It doesn't go far enough. It's not enough to just integrate into society. Society is irredeemably oppressive and it's structurally homophobic, et cetera, and therefore we must tear it down. So critical social justice approach is not compatible with liberalism. However, there is liberal social justice, which obviously is, and it comes out of the liberal tradition. Critical theory is a bit of a broader topic. It's often taught, for example, in like film criticism classes, right? And it can be a really useful tool for criticizing like a film and writing about it in an interesting way that discusses how it impacts culture and how culture impacts it, et cetera. That can be a beautiful, positive thing. It doesn't necessarily have to be illiberal in nature. That would come down to whether or not the analysis leans heavily on the CSJ side of things. But
well, that kind of brings me to what my question is. And we started out the conversation talking about, ILV has got, certain qualifications for liberalism that you can find on our website. And I'm wondering with queer majority, what exactly, do you have certain definitions as the editor-in-chief, when you are reading a piece, what to you are kind of the check marks to say this qualifies as a liberal piece? What are there any definitions, if you will, for you of what...
well, you mean a definition of liberalism, or
definition of liberalism? But like, what are kind of the key factors of liberalism?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I guess it's what you're asking me in a way is kind of a practical question, which is, as an editor, how do I rule out pieces?
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, I have to be honest and say it's really more a matter of just keeping an eye out for a lot of the red flags that I raised in my talk. Sometimes it'll be a little thing like, oh, they shamed somebody for being cis, or they threw out, they talked about the liberal world as if it's still, run by the patriarchy or whatever. And usually you can just tweak the language a little bit. And if the writer's okay with it, that's fine. But if it's obvious that the critical social justice worldview, if they've really bought into the orthodoxy of it and not just kind of going along with the orthopraxy a little bit, then yeah, you just have to pass on the piece. So I guess it would come down to how many red flags there are and whether or not it's a sign of the fact that the writer clearly has an anti-liberal disposition. I think liberals often accidentally say some things that don't go along with our values, or maybe we're not aware of it, and that's fine, and that's easy to fix as an editor. But if somebody really holds an anti-liberal worldview, then we're not going to publish them at Queer Majority. Not because we don't think they should be published anywhere. We are true liberals. We believe in free speech. However, they could get published at Pink News, which has a bigger readership than us. So go have at it. We exist for a specific reason.
That brings me to another, we talk often about liberalism. We talk often about critical social justice, critical queer theory, critical theory. Let's also define like critical theory. What are some of the premises of critical theory that make it an antithesis, or sets it apart from liberalism?
Well, critical social justice would be set apart from it in the sense that they have a conception of social justice, which really hinges a lot on the kind of equity versus equality argument, right? And it hinges on the integration versus dismantling argument, right? So if your goal is to integrate into society, it's liberal. If your goal is to dismantle institutions in liberal society so that you can remake society in a different image, then it's anti-liberal. And by the way, that's an approach that critical social justice activists have in common with, far-right fascists and people like that too, right? Because they're not just looking to reform liberal society either. They want to tear it down and build their fascist utopia. So don't be an extremist. Don't throw the baby out with the bathwater.
Right.
Don't take the incredible progress that we have achieved in the liberal West for granted, right? I think just make sure that you are putting things in perspective. And of course, society will never be perfect, and we're always going to be able to improve it. Liberals still believe in, and this is a mistake that liberals fall into, by the way, sometimes, which is we can be seen as kind of stubborn conservatives of a sort ourselves with a small c, who just want to preserve the status quo at all costs. And that's a mistake, because we lose a lot of potential allies that way. We should still believe in progress and making society even better. It's just that we believe the way to do that is through reform and reasoned discussion, not by dismantling things. And again, really quickly on the equality versus equity thing, right? We believe in equal treatment under the law. So we would argue that gay people should be able to get married because straight people can be married, right? We would not argue that LGBT, like if let's say 10% of the population are LGBT, therefore 10% of your employees must be LGBT. And not only that, but 10% of your management must be LGBT, et cetera. That's where a lot of the anti-liberal stuff in DEI comes in. Of course, you should want your organization to be diverse, but that doesn't mean completely abandoning, a belief in meritocracy. Lesbian, gay, bi, and trans people should be treated the same as anybody else, not given a leg up by virtue of who we are, or pushed down.
Mm-hmm. Now, I'm going to try to mesh two questions. I don't know if I'm going to do it with any elegance here, but my understanding of critical theory, one of the big points of it, though, is language is power, right? And it's how we use language to manipulate, certain outcomes and situations, and that kind of touches on the equity and equality. Yeah. You mentioned, you started the conversation by saying that these critical theory really makes minorities less happy. And I think that perhaps, though, where there is this illusion of happiness is in this idea of power. So I think, technically, you make a good point about minorities are less happy because it denies progress. It puts them in identity politics. So at a very kind of philosophical level, if you really think about it as an individual, you really are going to be less happy. But I see people pulling on some of these threads because it's a power play, right? Because, okay, if I say that I'm, I don't have these privileges, then you're going to give me these privileges and then some. Yeah. By claiming this, oppressed narrative. So I kind of see that where critical theory makes people think that they would be happy because it's also, ironically, a language of power.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, that would be, it's related to standpoint epistemology anyway, right? It's the idea that you don't judge whether or not somebody's argument is correct. Say you're trying to argue that you should get a promotion, right? You're not judging that based on the normal rules of logic that we liberals do. You're judging that solely based on how oppressed the person is. Oh, well, if you don't promote me, then you're discriminating against me as a Black trans lesbian or whatever, right? Yeah, that's certainly a technique that critical activists use. You don't have to give into it as a liberal. You shouldn't give into it, because not only would you be appeasing that person, but you could potentially be passing up somebody else who's more qualified and more deserving of that promotion, and discriminating against them. So I'm not sure if I addressed your question, but practically speaking, that's why we shouldn't let people get away with that kind of activity. And to be clear, I'm saying the critical approach to LGBT activism doesn't work. I'm not saying that, critical theory as an entire school of thought has nothing of value to contribute to society. I don't think that. But I do think that the critical approach that dominates LGBT activism and feminist activism and so forth today is toxic.
So I've got one final question. I'll give time for anyone else who wants to type in a question. But you had mention some of the things that critical theory tries to dismantle. One of the things that I look at a lot is, and perhaps I even overemphasize it, but is neo-Marxism, right? So do you see any like kind of those same trends as neo-Marxist trends playing out in critical queer theory?
Oh, definitely. Absolutely. Yeah.
Can you give some examples of how that might show up?
Well, I mean, the most obvious example that even somebody who is very skeptical of the neo-Marxist influence on CSJ would have to admit is people coming after our magazine for being capitalist, for example. Like literally say, how dare you publish an article that's pro-capitalism as an LGBT magazine? Don't you realize that as a good LGBT person, you must be anti-capitalist? I mean, you couldn't get a more specific example than that. But on a more abstract level, that argument for equity as opposed to equality comes in, not entirely, but it's partially inspired by by thinkers like Karl Marx, right? To each according to from each according to their ability, to each according to their need, right? Mm-hmm. That's not the liberal approach. Liberals believe in a positive sum, mutually beneficial, free exchange of ideas and goods and services across borders and all of that fun stuff. So I will say, though, I think that especially people like James Lindsay have overemphasized the Marxist influence to the point where people now are confused and think if, say, somebody like Kamala Harris uses the term equity, that must mean she's literally a Maoist. And that's just silly, right? That what we're saying is Marx as a thinker inspired some critical social justice thinkers. We're not saying that every critical social justice activist is a literal communist. Those are different things.
That, and also, I mean, I just think that we've gotten to such a messy place where language is like we always have to define our terms. I think a lot of people interchange equality and equity. Some do it on purpose, but some I think are genuinely don't know the difference. Mm-hmm. Okay, so we've got another question here. Don't sexuality, identity, gender, etc. change for many individuals over the course of their lives? For example, lots of people gain and lose interest in sex as they age. They mm-hmm. seem to suggest labels are not what we are, but how we are at the moment. Also, how does pedophilia fit into all of this?
Whoa, okay.
That's a lot.
I'll hit that point last. Okay. The first question is a really good question, and the answer is basically yes. People don't choose their orientation. It probably is at least partially genetically determined. However, there are other factors that impact it. We don't fully understand it. And people's sexuality, the way they perceive it in any case, absolutely does change over the course of their lives. Lisa Diamond is a researcher who has done some great investigations into particularly sexual fluidity among women. And it's rather common for women to come out in their 40s to themselves and say, oh my gosh, suddenly I just realized I want to have a girlfriend and never had a gay thought in my life up until now. That's a fairly extreme example, but it's not as rare as you would think. Like I said, it happens. And so, yeah, people's perception of their sexuality definitely changes. Another example that comes to mind is Christopher Hitchens, the British writer, Vanity Fair columnist, great guy. Was rather in his autobiography, he spoke about how when he was younger, he was bisexual and he experimented with other boys and stuff. And as he got older, he was rather blunt about it. He said, I'm probably still bi, but if I'm going to be honest, the kinds of guys I'm attracted to aren't attracted to me anymore because I'm an old guy. And so I just have, however, I'm still perfectly able to attract women that I'm attracted to. So for all intents and purposes, I'm now straight. And I thought that was a really good example of somebody interrogating their own experience of their sexuality over time.
Super interesting. All right. Do you want to touch on
the pedophilia thing?
Yes, I was going to say,
I'm not afraid of it.
You're not off the hook.
Well, remember when I said that whether it's innate or voluntary is a red herring? It definitely is. People, unfortunately, they have the misfortune of being born that way sometimes, so to speak, born that way, in the sense that they don't choose it, just like people don't choose to be gay. However, unlike consensual homosexual sex between adults, pedophilia is not a victimless crime, so to speak. It does actually impact, in a sense, children. And so for that reason, I think it should remain illegal. That, you know, there are lots of things. People are also born tall or short or whatever, right? We get our genes, a genetic tendency toward being tall or short that manifests itself over time, right? In the same way orientation does. So whether or not something has a genetic component is kind of irrelevant to the moral question. The moral question should come down to whether or not it's the kind of behavior that society needs to restrict in order to protect innocent people, or if it's a kind of behavior that we should set free so that people can flourish and be happy because it's harmless.
Okay. Now, one final question, I think, unless more pop up. There, you talked about gender identity being a cultural construct.
Mm-hmm.
That is something that I think is heavily debated, and perhaps is an example, and I would love to hear from you, of a liberalism. So when, you know, let's kind of put this in context, like, and maybe I'm making the wrong example here, but if gender is a construct, when people talking about like transgender are identifying and then playing sports.
Yeah. No, that's not a bad example at all. That's a perfect example. Obviously, we've covered this issue many different ways, very nuanced ways, looking at all of these concerns in QM. And I think anybody who goes and reads 10 or 20 pieces on trans issues will notice that we're extremely sensitive to those kinds of concerns. And they absolutely can be illiberal. But you might notice that a lot of it hinges on the false belief, right, that because someone identifies as a trans woman, for example, therefore they should have all of the same privileges that an actual biological female would have. And that is actually an area where thinking of making the distinction between a biological construct and a cultural construct can actually be helpful. And that's what I mean by it being a liberal approach. We're respecting the fact that we, as humans, we're highly cultural, and gender is something that matters to us. Things like how we dress and how we present ourselves, and how we want to be seen by others, especially by friends and family and people we want to be around because they respect us for how we see ourselves. That is something that is deeply important to people. Iona Italia, who I mentioned earlier, wrote a piece for us called In Defense of Gender that I would recommend. If anybody is skeptical of that idea, I'd really recommend you go read that piece.
I'll put it
because
in
it's very respectful of the fact that a trans woman is not literally a female, and that has important implications in terms of things like sports and prisons and so forth. But, you know, those are edge cases. 99% of the time, you can respect a trans woman as a trans woman without running into those kinds of problems. Society might have to say, in certain cases, sex has to be the standard, not identity.
Yeah, but those, I mean, I agree. They're small. We do have to step back and go, these are small issues. But when it happens, like at the Olympics, right? And then I know that wasn't a trans issue. I know that she wasn't trans. She was, but I mean, those are the things that build this up, and then it explodes. It's like, oh my gosh, it's everywhere. You see it everywhere. But I mean, it has been in the past couple of years been a hot topic. And I've got, I'm forgetting her last name. She is a popular trans writer in the UK, Debbie, and I forgot the last name. You might have heard of her, but one of her things was, hey, she's got a very elegant, simple solution. We have a category in sports. We have a category for biological men, a category for biological women, and then we have an all category. And if you're a biological woman and you want to go in the all category, that's up to you, right? Sure. But then we have an all category, and I've always thought, what an elegant and just simple way to say, okay, if you are not if you are a biological man who identifies as a woman, go into the all category. You can still compete, and stop making it so messy,
Yeah, I think it also likely, I mean, I'm by no means an expert on sports, but I would suspect that in some sports, the biological differences are much more significant, and then in others, they maybe don't matter much at all. I think most of the time, it's closer to the significant side, especially when it comes to highly physical sports and so forth. But I don't know. Like, for example, is it true that men and women should compete separately in chess? I'd have to ask a chess expert, right? And so I think I wish I had thought of a more athletic example than chess. But I guess
actually, that's really interesting. I haven't thought about it like that. I mean,
break dancing. It was at the Olympics.
Yeah. Oh my gosh, break! I don't. They have.
We could go off on that for an hour.
Yeah. Well, with that said, we'll let you go. I will let everyone know. I will put in the notes this, if you give me a link, Rio, to this slideshow, I will put that in the notes on YouTube, and I will also put Iona Italia's piece in defense of gender. So thank you very much for this. Was so helpful for me in terms of, we're always talking about not just about the liberalism, but defining terms. And we're always talking against each other, like I said, even just with equity and inequality, but with all the terms that you literally took the time to lay out, queer, bi, etc., I thought was incredibly helpful. So thank you so much for doing it and for your time today.
Yeah, thanks for inviting me.
All right, Ria, I'll see you again soon. Thank you, everyone.
Bye.